Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. This podcast has featured several episodes profiling individuals with a passion for local radio. This is another one, but very different. Steve Cogan grew up in radio. He learned early on that journalism was going to be his passion. But it is his retirement project that is the focus of this profile. Kingston Radio Rewind is a Facebook page managed by Steve and features memorabilia and stories about the early days of radio here in Kingston, Ontario. The posts may be about this city, but I'm sure those of you listening from elsewhere will relate. This episode was recorded in early March 2024. Here is my conversation with Steve Cogan. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Dave, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Happy to be with you.
And thank you for participating. I appreciate that. You happen to be the curator of a Facebook page called Kingston Radio Rewind, and we will spend a lot of time talking about that in a moment. But I thought I'd start by getting a little bit of background on you, primarily because I see that in your resume that journalism seems to have been your passion from day one. And I'm curious as to why journalism and why pursue a degree from Michigan State University.
Great questions, Dave. I started in journalism when I was 14 years old. I had the privilege of being the son of one of the managers at CJAI Radio in Kingston. And he would, when I was quite a young boy, he would take me to the station occasionally. And like I think most young boys would, I was fascinated with the technology, fascinated with the hustle and the bustle, fascinated with the perceived glamour of broadcasting. And so I started bugging my dad for a job at CJAI, even just a part-time job while I was going to school, even something unpaid. And when I was 14 years old in 1972, I had the opportunity to work at CJAI during the summer in the newsroom. And I was what I think is referred to as a gopher, meaning the professionals in the newsroom would say, Steve, go for the paper. Steve, go for coffee, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I did as a 14-year-old. But I have to say, by the end of that first summer, I was performing, shall we say, pseudo-journalistic functions. I was dubbing tapes. I was helping to process film, and it was film in those days, for the sister station, Channel 11. I was beginning to perform. In a somewhat journalistic capacity, and that was also, Dave, around the time that journalism was had a certain importance in popular culture. 1972 was, if I recall correctly, the year of the Watergate break-in. And then the investigations of the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein, Bob Woodward, All the President's Men, and so on. And the indications in the popular culture that journalism was an important pursuit. So between the fun I was having in that newsroom as a teenager and my sense that journalism was an important vocation, I became interested in pursuing it as a career. And as you said in your question to me, really that's something I picked up on and stayed with until my retirement.
Why Michigan State?
A couple of reasons. My dad was from Michigan. He was born in Dearborn, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. And so we had that attachment to Michigan as a family. When I was wrapping up my undergrad in Canada, I started looking around for graduate programs, and Michigan State looked very attractive to me. It was one of the so-called journalism Ivies. It had a very good reputation, and it was close to home, relatively close to home in East Lansing, Michigan. And it kind of met the sentimental criteria of going to school in Michigan. And I was fortunate to have the support of my parents and of my grandmother at the time in helping to pay the freight, as it were, to go to Michigan State. And so for all of those reasons, and I think probably the single biggest was that I was impressed with the quality of the program, impressed with the breadth of the program, print and broadcast. And I would be able to do a master's degree in just a little over a year with the undergrad that I had. All of that led me to Michigan State.
Okay. I was going to do this later, but I'll do it now. And in the interest of full disclosure,
Yeah.
in 1972, I graduated from Queens and I started working at CKWS Radio, and I was hired by your father. And so we'll make references to your dad as we go through this. But before we get to your dad, let's talk about you graduating from Michigan State. And you got work at the Kingston Week Standard, which for folks who are not from Kingston is the daily newspaper, has been for a long time. You ended up at NBC in New York City, which intrigues me, and eventually landing back in Canada at the CBC. So let's talk about that era when you're actually in journalism before you moved on to another career.
Well, a lot of it, Dave, has to do with my wife, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at Michigan State, I was engaged to Barbara, and Barbara was going to Queens. And so when I graduated, I came back to Kingston. Barbara was at Queens, and I was looking for work and sent out my resume to the relatively few newsrooms that there were in Kingston at the time. And I got a phone call from Neil Reynolds, who was the editor at the Kingston Week Standard at that time. So this would have been around 1984. So Barb's at Queens. I'm coming back to Kingston because we're engaged to be married. And I'm very fortunate to land a job at the Week Standard. And that was during what I think many would say was a golden era for the Whig, Neil Reynolds being the editor, and a bunch of other editors like Harvey Schachter and Sheldon McNeil and Norris MacDonald and so on, who were just outstanding. That was the period of time when the Whig was considered one of the best newspapers in Canada. And I was just very fortunate to land at the Whig at that time. So Barbara, we're living in Kingston. I'm working at the Whig. Barbara's going to Queens. Barb graduates from MacArthur College with her Bachelor of Education. And at that time, there weren't many teaching jobs, or maybe we can even say any teaching jobs in Ontario. There was a glut of teachers in Ontario. But the New York City school systems were savvy enough to promote themselves at MacArthur College as a potential workplace for teachers graduating from Queens. And Barbara got a job teaching at a Catholic school in the Bronx. She went down for a series of interviews and was offered a job at one of the Catholic elementary schools in the Bronx. And so we moved to New York. And I was really going on Barb's coattails. I didn't have a job. Once again, I sent out a bunch of resumes. And when we're talking New York, we're talking a bunch of resumes because there are a whole lot of newsrooms in that city. And again, I did have a few offers, but I was very fortunate. One of the offers was from NBC News. And so I started at NBC as a writer and editor in the network radio newsroom, and worked there. And then Barbara is teaching at the Catholic school in the Bronx, St. Margaret Mary. And we're watching the situation in Ontario, because Ontario is our home for both of us. And we're seeing that the situation for hiring teachers in Ontario is beginning to lighten up. Barbara senses that the time is right to apply to teach in Ontario. She does, and gets a job with the what was then called the Peel Board of Education, now the Peel District School Board. She gets a job in Peel, and we move back to Canada. And again, luck was with me, and I've been very lucky, Dave, and I know it. Luck was with me, and with the experience that I had and the education that I had, I landed at CBC News in Toronto in the old National Radio newsroom on Jarvis Street. And again, I was a writer and editor working on shows like what was then called The World at 8, Canada at 5, The World at 6, the regular hourly newscasts, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at the CBC that I began to teach part-time, at first at Ryerson and at Centennial College, which is a big college in the East End of Toronto. And Centennial offered me full-time, and then I transitioned to academe.
So you become a teacher as well.
Yes.
Now, what was it about teaching that you liked?
Well, when I was at Ryerson at Centennial and Centennial part-time, what I liked was that I got to talk about issues and themes in broadcast news and in journalism generally. Working in a newsroom is terrific, Dave, and I did it for a long time and loved it. But when you're working in a newsroom, you're immersed in the story of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And in a broadcast newsroom, you're immersed in the story of the hour or the story of the moment. When you're teaching, you're able to kind of step back and look at journalism more broadly, talk about some of the things that are going on in journalism as a profession. And I kind of enjoyed that. I kind of enjoyed the analysis. And I also have to say, I enjoyed being around young people at journalism school who were coming to the craft as newbies with their eyes wide open and their enthusiasm intact. And it was fun, frankly. It was fun. It was invigorating to deal with young people, to deal with students who were seeing journalism with fresh eyes.
So your opportunity to mold, or at least help mold, a future generation of journalists.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Let's move to your retirement in 2017. And you're sitting around looking for a project. As most retired folks, one of the things that we talked about a few minutes ago was your dad. And one of the things I learned only recently is how long he had actually worked at CKWS. How many years was he there?
About 25. He started in the late 50s and finished in the early 80s. He started as an announcer. He had worked in radio prior to that. He had started in, I think, 1949. He would have been 18 years old at CFCF in Montreal, where he was raised. CFCF famously being Canada's first radio station. In fact, North America's first radio station. So he worked at CFCF, began as a record librarian, but worked at several radio stations in Ontario as an announcer, and landed at CKWS in the late 50s as an announcer, and then within a few years was program director and stayed program director until the early 80s, about 25 years at CKWS.
So Carl is working in radio, and like anyone else who works in radio, from time to time, memorabilia crosses your desk. And some people just throw it out and other people put it in a box somewhere. So from what I gather, that when both of your parents passed away and you and your brother were dealing with the family home and selling that, you came across all of these boxes that presumably your dad had accumulated, and you took custody of these boxes. And what happened next? What did you do with all of that memorabilia?
Well, you've summarized it very well. He was he was a decent scrapbooker and a good collector generally. And I should say too, Dave, my mom worked at CKWS on the administrative side in the late 50s. So there was some memorabilia related to her as well. And even post CKWS, my dad went to the Voice of America in Washington as a producer after CKWS, and there were a few things from there as well. But to get to your question, so my dad passed in 2008. And my mom survived him and eventually passed as well. In 2017, my brother and I are faced with the family home. My parents have both passed. We're cleaning up the home. There are these boxes in the basement. I opened them up and knew right away, Dave, that these things were too precious to throw away. Knew right away that I wanted to hang on to them. I had no idea at that time that I would be doing something like Kingston Radio Rewind. No idea at all. I just knew that I didn't want to throw these things away, that they were too sentimental to me. So they came to Mississauga, where I was living at the time, still do live in Mississauga. Those boxes came with me to Mississauga, along with some other items from the home, and basically sat until around 2021, when I remembered that 1942 was the sign-on of CKWS AM 960, the original CKWS, and 1947 was the sign-on of the original CKWS FM at 96.3. So those anniversaries, both of them, the 80th anniversary of 960's sign on and the 75th anniversary of 96.3's sign on, both of those were coming up in 2022. I've got these boxes of memorabilia. I've got these anniversaries coming up in 2022. So I contacted the program director of Chorus Radio in Kingston. Chorus Radio at that time owned the descendant stations, shall we say, of the original CKWS radio. And I said, hey, did you know that these anniversaries were coming up? And he didn't, and that's cool. That's cool. He didn't, and he said, this is really interesting. Let's talk. But this was also when COVID was just about at its height, Dave. And he emailed me a few months later and said, COVID's a concern around here. And reading between the lines of his email, he wasn't interested anymore in pursuing the collaboration that I was suggesting. I was suggesting that I work with the stations on doing some sort of anniversary website, say. Mm-hmm. But while there was initial enthusiasm, the enthusiasm waned. And again, that's fine. They had their own fish to fry, so to speak, and they had COVID to deal with. I suspect that some of their staff were working remotely and so on. So they made their decision. It was cool with me, but I still wanted to do something to mark the anniversary of CKWS Radio. And so in 2022, I went solo and began a Facebook page called Kingston Radio Rewind. I have to say, Dave, I had never been on Facebook. I was fortunate to have daughters and a wife who weren't as technically challenged and weren't as Facebook challenged as I was, and they nursed me through the opening stages of setting something up. But in the summer of 2022, that's exactly what I did. I set something up, and it took off from there.
Let's talk about the early days. Now, when we're talking about the radio stations in Kingston, I know that we're focusing on Kingston, Ontario. But if folks who are listening to this podcast from other communities, I'm sure they can relate to the early days of radio in their own communities and the evolution of news stations and competition and all that sort of thing. But as I was growing up in Kingston, when I moved to Kingston in 1966, and I was a teenager going to high school, and I knew that there was competition between CKWS and another station that came along later, which was CKLC, and the descendants of that particular station as well. Describe the scene way back then when these two stations came into being, and sort of the overall differences in a general sense from the stations now.
Sure. Well, I feel the need to back up just slightly, Dave, and point out that radio in Kingston actually started in 1922 with a station that I know is near and dear to your heart, CFRC, on the campus of Queen's University. It was one of Canada's first radio stations. It was one of the first 30 radio stations in all of Canada, which is amazing that a city the size of Kingston had a radio station so soon. CFRC was a CBC affiliate for its first 20 years or so. It had a kind of sporadic beginning, but then it settled down and was a CBC affiliate. In 1942, the Whig Standard was a going concern, and the owners of the Whig Standard, seeing that radio was kind of a brave new world in media, and it was a brave new world that they wanted to plant their feet in, the owners of the Whig Standard started CKWS Radio, and started it in the Whig Standard building, as a matter of fact, on King Street, and took over the CBC for Kingston purposes, the CBC affiliateship. And then in 1957, I think it was, about 15 years later, a group of mainly local businessmen start a rival station, CKLC, and the two stations are kind of off to the races in terms of their competition. Both stations, I think, were aiming their programming at popularity. The CBC had two networks at that time, and CKWS Radio was an affiliate of the so-called Trans-Canada Network, which was arts and letters and current affairs, maybe a bit more high-minded. CKLC was an affiliate for its first 10 years or so of the Dominion Network, which was a more light entertainment network. But the two stations were both CBC affiliates, and outside of the CBC programming, they were carrying essentially popular music and community-oriented shows, both aimed at building an audience among the Kingston population generally. I think that the rivalry between the two stations was civil, if not always friendly, at least civil. And I think that both stations, when rock and roll came along in the late 50s, saw that this was a thing to pick up on, and both of them moved to pop rock in the 1960s and certainly in the 1970s. And competed on that basis. There were certainly differences between the two. I think CKWS Radio had more of a reputation for news, for instance. I think CKLC may have had more of a reputation for youth. CKWS and CKLC both had FM stations. In fact, CKWS was the first radio station in Canada to use FM. And CKLC had an FM station as well. CKLC transitioned to kind of an adult contemporary format on the FM side. CKWS FM transitioned to more of a country format on the FM side. But I think the story of the two stations generally, from their inception, CKWS in the 40s and CKLC in the 50s, I think the story of the two stations is one of being mainstream stations trying to appeal with popular programming to a mainstream audience in the city of Kingston.
One of the aspects that applied to both stations back then that doesn't apply now is the fact that the stations were locally owned
Yes.
back in their initial days.
Yes, that's
which
right.
has a
Yeah.
big impact on the relationship between the stations and their audience. Let's talk about some of the firsts, in addition to CKWS being the first to use FM. I didn't know this until I saw your little blurb on one of your posts. Was CKWS was one of the first stations to play the music of the Beatles.
Yeah, it's I think quite an interesting story. I spoke to an alumnus of CKWS who said that he thinks that it had to do with the RCA record plant in Smiths Falls. Capitol Records, which was the label of the Beatles, had too many records to press and not enough capacity to press them. And my understanding is that Capitol Records in Canada contracted with some non-Capitol facilities, including the RCA record pressing plant in Smiths Falls. Now that plant is long gone, but once upon a time, there was an RCA record pressing plant in Smiths Falls. And so RCA in Smiths Falls is pressing Beatle records. And my understanding is that the earliest of the Beatle records, they may not have even been ready yet for public distribution, for public sale, but the earliest of the Beatle records made their way down to Kingston, made their way into the offices of CKWS, where they were played. The programmers heard something new, something fresh, something exciting, and said, "We got to get this on the air." And so they did. And CKWS started playing She Loves You in October of 1963, which was one of the earliest airplays of a Beatle record in all of North America, well before their vaunted appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of '64. So yeah, it really is kind of a cool aspect of Kingston radio, a real landmark in the history of the Beatles, a landmark that was put down in Kingston.
Mm-hmm. One of the other aspects of radio back in the 50s and early 60s was the variety of programming. And CKWS had a variety series that they aired, and it featured music from, as I understand it, a band that was ensconced in the Kingston Penitentiary.
Yeah.
And there is a connection to a very well-known pop artist from that era, and describe that one.
Yeah. Well, it really is. It's kind of one of the most interesting aspects of my work for Kingston Radio Rewind was this development. We knew that there had been a summer variety series on CKWS between, I think it was 1952 and 1955, 12 episodes every summer from the Chapel of Kingston Penitentiary, a variety show with nothing but inmate talent. And there was amazingly a lot of talent, and a lot of it very polished, among the inmates at Kingston Penitentiary. So CKWS Radio aired this variety series. They produced it themselves. The show was picked up, by the way, by other radio stations in Ontario. A network was created around the summer variety series. But in any case, CKWS produced it, originated it, produced it from the Chapel of Kingston Pen for 4 summers. And flash forward now, Dave, to I think it was 1992, so 40 years later. And a reporter for the Ottawa Citizen tracks down the biological father of the rock superstar Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton was conceived in the liaison of a Canadian soldier named Edward Fryer and a 16-year-old British girl. This was during the Second World War. And the soldier took off. And all Eric Clapton ever knew of his father was that it was a Canadian soldier named Edward Fryer. So in 1992, a reporter for the Ottawa Citizen tracks this Edward Fryer down. And he's died by then, but his identity is finally established. And the Citizen reporter figures out that this guy had been a drifter once he returned to Canada, a drifter, a gifted musician, played in bars and clubs, even strip clubs between Southern Ontario and Florida. Drifted between those two places for years, eking out a living as a pianist in bars and lounges. The reporter for the Citizen knows that he played in Kingston. Kingston was one of the haunts that he worked in, including the downtown Holiday Inn in the early 70s. We know Fryer played there. But we didn't know, no one knew that Edward Fryer had been incarcerated at Kingston Penitentiary until 2022, when a Montreal journalist picking up on the trail of Edward Fryer interviews a woman in Montreal who says, "My mother told me," and her mother had been one of Edward Fryer's many girlfriends and a few wives as well. Her mother had been associated with Edward Fryer, and she said, "My mom told me that Fryer took off with their money, and she tracked him down, to Kingston Penitentiary." So there's now an indication that not only was Fryer in Kingston, but he was in Kingston Pen. Now, the archivists at the Kingston Penitentiary Museum were kind enough to loan me the two remaining shows, the audio of the two remaining shows, the only two that are still in existence, apparently, from Kingston Penitentiary is on the Air. That was the name of the variety show. Kingston Penitentiary is on the Air. They loaned me the audio for those two shows, and they loaned me some documents related to the production. One of the names in the documents is pianist, arranger, band leader, Edward Fryer. I Googled Edward Fryer's name, and it came up as overlapping with the Edward Fryer who had been in Kingston, according to the Ottawa Citizen, and the Edward Fryer who had been in Kingston Pen, according to the follow-up story that was done by the Montreal journalist. So I went back to Kingston Penitentiary and I said, can you give me the full name? Can you give me the date of birth? Can you give me the city of birth of this Edward Fryer who was on the show, Kingston Penitentiary is on the Air? And lo and behold, it is the same Edward Fryer that the Citizen had identified, that the Montreal journalist had identified.
So we know where Eric Clapton inherited some of his musical genes.
Yeah, exactly. Like father, like son.
Do we know if Eric Clapton ever heard this story about his dad being in Kingston Pen?
We know that he knew. About his father having been tracked down by the Ottawa Citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that he knew that his father was in Kingston Pen, or that his father played on a radio show. Now, before I published my posts about this, I thought it was the decent thing to do to try to alert him.
Yeah.
So I wrote a letter to his management company and said very specifically, I'm not looking for anything here but to let Mr. Clapton know that his father was in Kingston Penitentiary and his father was a musician on some radio shows, And if he wants those radio shows, I have them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I never heard back.
Yeah.
I never heard back. And I'm told as well that the Ottawa Citizen reporter who tracked Edward Fryer down didn't hear back either. Nor did the Kingston Whig Standard. The Kingston Whig Standard did a story when I posted my finding, as it were, that Eric Clapton had been in Kingston Pen, and that Eric Clapton had played on Kingston Penitentiary as on the air. When I posted that, the Kingston Whig Standard did a story about it. And as far as I know, Eric Clapton didn't contact the Whig, didn't contact the Citizen, certainly didn't contact me. But I'm pretty sure that the original Citizen story from 1992 is posted on the Eric Clapton website, so he knows that.
When it comes to, we should tell our listeners that the Kingston Radio Rewind page on Facebook is accessible, and we'll put the connection in the liner notes to the podcast so that people can go there and have a look around. I want to take a few minutes and just talk about some of the differences between radio back then and radio now in a very general sense, and maybe get specific in a couple of areas. Let's start with music. The differences between the radio station announcers playing the music that is on the station.
Yeah, well, I would say, Dave, that in the early days of radio, radio stations, I think, would play a variety of music. They would play some classical, they would play some swing, they would play some jazz, they would play some show tunes. And radio stations would boast impressive record libraries that would stock thousands of discs, going back to Enrico Caruso and Al Jolson on 78s, and all the way up to, why don't we just say arbitrarily, if we're talking, say, 1950 or so, it would include Glenn Miller and Doris Day and Frank Sinatra, and a variety of artists. And shows would be programmed in a block kind of format, where there would be a swing show, there would be a classical show, there would be a jazz show. And the announcers on these shows would often be specialists in their areas, and they would work with record librarians who would have special knowledge in the various areas of music. These were professionals and specialists, these record librarians. Often radio stations would also have music directors who had their own expertise. And so announcers would work with record librarians, would work with music directors, and would present specialized music in block formats. And I would say what began to happen, particularly with the advent of rock and roll, is that radio stations moved away from block programming and began to specialize in one genre or another.
Mm-hmm.
And on AM radio in particular, rock was so popular that a lot of radio stations began to program rock exclusively or almost exclusively. Pop rock from Elvis Presley through the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, CCR, you name it, but rock and pop.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably began with stations like Chum in Toronto, kind of setting aside the block programming format and going to all rock all the time. But in Kingston as well, CKWS and CKLC weren't too far behind in setting aside that block programming format and going to all rock pop, or almost all rock pop. I know that CKWS in particular had CBC programs on that were not rock or not pop, in addition to their pop programming. But eventually, I think both Kingston radio stations were known as pop rock stations, catering to a youthful audience. And I would say as well that as that evolution occurred from a variety of musical genres to specializing in rock, I would say that the kind of model of record librarians and music directors, I would say that model began to fade, probably because there wasn't the need for that kind of expertise. And the announcers themselves took that expertise over, began to pick their own music, program their own shows, and off to the races. They'd take their vinyl LPs, their vinyl 45s, take them into the control room, stack them up, and start slapping them on the turntable and playing them.
Mm-hmm. I remember that well. You talk about block programming. When I worked at CKWS FM in the 70s and 80s, we had, for a while, we had country music on the air during the day. And then in the evening, we had classical music,
Yeah.
which was a major change for the listener at 6 o'clock when things really changed.
Yes.
But that just testifies to what you mentioned about the block programming business. Radio personalities, and let's differentiate them from the news staff. But
Sure.
we have radio personalities who became personalities as opposed to eras when radio announcers would be just saying this is in terms of the music that they were playing and not given the opportunity to be creative and do different things. In your examination of some of the memorabilia, do you see any trends in terms of how radio personalities sort of evolved over the time that you've been looking through your stuff?
Yeah, I think, Dave, the thing that's most striking to me is when both CKWS and CKLC moved toward rock and pop on AM, 960 CKWS and 1380 CKLC, when those two stations moved to rock and pop, the radio announcers and the listeners' relationship with those radio announcers became fairly intense. And I think young people in Kingston, and this goes for my peer group, and I think it went for a lot of teenagers in Kingston, they would pick their favorites, pick their favorite stations, and pick their favorite DJs. In Kingston, if you not only were a fan of 960 CKWS, but you could name your favorite disc jockeys, people like John Murray and brother John Hanlon and Greg Stewart and Neil Kirby. Those were names and personalities that teenagers in Kingston gravitated to. And on the CKLC side, disc jockeys like Gary Parr and Gary Shannon. These were DJs that some teenagers in Kingston felt loyalty to, and they felt loyalty to CKLC. So I would say that the personality aspect came on quite strong in the 60s and 70s as those stations became identified with pop rock, and Kingston teenagers kind of picked their sides, picked their stations, and picked the DJs that were their favorites. But I think honestly, Dave, radio in Kingston and radio generally, going back even to the early days, there were some personalities. Al Baliska on CKLC when it first started. Brian Olney on CKWS is a legendary figure, maybe the most legendary DJ in the history of Kingston radio. Yeah, I think that while you're absolutely correct that there have been periods and announcers who really were kind of placeholder, deep voices, authoritative deliveries, and their roles were essentially to say, that was so-and-so singing such and such, and now here is so-and-so singing such and such. I think you're right that there was that kind of DJing in the early days. Even going back though to the early days of radio, there were some personalities who kind of established the model for later on, and the very personality-driven radio that we began to see in the 60s and 70s.
Lauren Green is another example of somebody.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And Lauren Green, an amazing actor, Battlestar Galactica, Bonanza on NBC, and before that he was on CFRC, Queens Radio. Another amazing Kingston connection to an iconic performer.
News people. So we're talking radio news here as opposed to television news.
Yeah.
And news coverage on radio has changed quite remarkably over time. Aside from the CBC, which is, for those people who may not be listening from Canada, is the national radio and television broadcaster. They continue to have news, but a lot of local stations don't have as much news as they once had. But if you go back to the early days of CKWS radio, for instance, an iconic name in that era was Floyd Patterson, as one who basically, he was there. I can't even remember how long Floyd was at the radio station, but he was there a long time.
Yes, he was.
Journalism near and dear to your heart based upon your background. So what have you seen with respect to news on the radio?
That's a great question, Dave, and I'm inclined to be a little bit downcast as I think about what's happened to news on the radio. When radio began in Canada and when radio began in Kingston, well, what we can, I think, safely restrict our conversation here to Kingston to make the point. When CKWS Radio signed on in 1942, the Second World War was raging. I read that 1 in 10 Canadians served in the armed forces for Canada at some point during the Second World War, 10% of the population. So in Kingston, everyone knew someone who was serving in the forces. And the Second World War was surely the most important thing to happen in the last century. And there were 2 newsrooms of note in all of Kingston, the Kingston Week Standard and CKWS Radio. And the Kingston Week Standard subscribed to the Canadian Press wire service and would have war news the following day, just given what the logistics of newspaper production, what those logistics were. But CKWS Radio could deliver the war news, which was so important to Kingstonians, on that very same day. And it did. Mm-hmm. And I have audio of reporters with the CBC, and CKWS was affiliated with the CBC. Greats like Matthew Halton and Peter Stursberg delivering war coverage from Europe, from Italy, from France, the day the battles occurred. And CKWS was able to carry those reports and deliver them to Kingstonians. That's how important radio news was to Kingston and to Canada in those early days. It really is, when I think about it now, kind of mind-boggling how important the news was and how radio had the market somewhat cornered in terms of the timely delivery of this important news. But then things began to shift, and the media landscape began to diversify. And of course, a huge development was television. And when television came along, radio, as a matter of survival, had to change. And radio moved from long-form newscasts, in-depth newscasts, the kind of thing that CKWS was carrying for its first 15 years on 960, radio had to evolve to survive, and what they did was they moved to kind of a headline service. Radio stations in Canada, in Kingston and in Canada, moved to kind of a headline service, news on the hour, which would be brief, a brief synopsis of the major stories of the hour and of the day. And the longer form newscasts were left to television. Mm-hmm. Now, there were some exceptions to this, Dave. I mean, to this day, the CBC does a half-hour newscast, CBC Radio, that is, called World at 6. So there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, radio moved to kind of a headline service. And then I would say the next kind of watershed development was deregulation. Deregulation, which I think kind of we associate in Canadian radio with the Mulroney administration, where Canadian radio was told you don't have to do as much news and as much public affairs. And a lot of radio stations were very happy about this, by the way. Radio news and public affairs is expensive to produce. It doesn't necessarily capture the mass audience that more popular programming like music captures. And so a lot of radio stations were happy about this deregulation. But the bottom line was that radio stations were told they didn't have to do as much news and public affairs, and a lot of them moved away from it. And I think what we have in 2024 is a radio landscape where news is really de-emphasized, on some stations practically non-existent. You have the offers of some artificial intelligence computer creators offering radio stations now newscasts without people. You'll be able to get news, program it on your radio station without even having professional journalists anymore. The voice will be created. Mm-hmm. The news will be written by artificial intelligence. Now, that's not, I don't think it's quite practical yet, but I think it's coming, and we'll see if that's the next sort of watershed. So from foreground news in the beginning, foreground programmed news in the beginning, to kind of background programmed news in the intermediate stage, to news being de-emphasized, and maybe in the future, news not even being produced in-house anymore, being created through artificial intelligence. We'll have to see how that unfolds. Mm-hmm. But the trend in radio, from the perspective of a journalist like myself, the trend in radio has kind of been a discouraging one, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to wrap up with something more general. You're curating, preserving, promoting the history of radio in Kingston. You are a journalist by training. So based upon your experience and reaction to the Facebook page from people who have read it, just how important is preserving history?
Apparently important. I'm very gratified, Dave, by the reaction to Kingston Radio Rewind. I didn't know what to expect when I first put it up, but I've been pleasantly surprised. Facebook sends me a report on the reach of the page. And in February, for instance, the last month for which I have numbers, Facebook says that Kingston Radio Rewind reached a little over 11,000 people, which is terrific. And I had 1 month where I think it was 22,000 and change. I've had other months where it's only been a few thousand. Mm-hmm. So it varies, but it does seem like there are people out there who were interested. I think, to be honest with you, Dave, there are two kinds of people following a page like Kingston Radio Rewind. There are alumni of Kingston Radio, people who used to work in Kingston Radio. And I've had feedback from people who were affiliated with CFRC as well as CKLC. In addition to CKWS, most of my material is related to CKWS, but not all. I have had stuff about CFRC and CKLC and will in future. Most of my stuff is related to CKWS, but I've had people from across the professional board, alumni from the different stations who look in on it. But in addition to that, Dave, I think the majority of my audience is Kingstonians who just remember those days, so to speak. Remember listening to Greg Stewart and Neil Kirby and John Hanlon, listening to their favorite music from those DJs in the 60s and 70s. And they get a kick out of the air checks that I'm able to digitize and put up on the site. They get a kick out of the old photos that I've got of CKWS from those days, the old newspaper ads that I'm able to digitize and post. I think it's a sentimental journey for them. And a lot of us, myself included, like nostalgia. And Kingston Radio Rewind is a heavy dose of nostalgia that I just think strikes a chord for Kingstonians, as well as for alumni of those radio stations.
It's great looking back at the hairstyles and the fashion from back in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, absolutely.
Steve, I want to thank you very much for bringing back all kinds of memories for those of us who did work in that era in Kingston radio. And thank you for preserving the history of radio in this community. And
Well,
I'm
thank you,
thinking there's a book in there somewhere.
I'm going to have to see if I have that much ambition in me. But for now, Kingston Radio Rewind is sure a lot of fun and challenging at times, and certainly gratifying in terms of the feedback I'm getting. And we'll see what's down the road.
I appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Dave, thank you for the invitation. It's been a blast speaking with you.
Steve Cogan, curator of the Facebook page Kingston Radio Rewind. And again, my thanks to Steve for his participation. I'll add the address for the page to the liner notes. To those of you who have downloaded this episode, thank you. I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast at gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.